Hello, and welcome to Making It Stick, a practical approach to dissemination and implementation. My name is Rochelle Espiritu, and I'm the co-director for the Pacific Southwest MHTTC. This is part 3 of our series, our final working session on how do we put what we've learned into practice. Today, we'll be talking about evaluation of implementation through the REAIM framework, and we'll offer some time in small groups to talk about how to put this all together. This is actually a recording of our original session because our first recording didn't work out. So I want to use this time to thank our collaborative team that put this together, which was a work group from the Dissemination and Implementation Group of MHTTCs. So I'd like to thank Heather Gotham from the NCO, John Olson from the Northwest, Molly Lopez from Southwest, Scott Gatsky from the Great Lakes, and Joni Dulce, who offered our case study and is from the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. And finally, thank you to Ricky Canello from the NCO for keeping us all together. So just as a little recap from part 2, how do we decide what to do from here? We talked about some strategies around engaging the audience, and this includes things like conducting a readiness assessment or implementing application processes, or maybe even most importantly, pulling together your TA team to walk through an implementation plan from the very beginning. We also offered that it is important to think about the context at multiple levels, from the individual level to organizational and systems level, and think about all the different variables that impact and can impact implementation. And finally, we offered some evidence-based implementation strategies and really talked about how important it is to tailor the strategies to the stage or the context in which your TA center is operating. So now I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, John Olson, who will walk us through the next part of this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hey there. So my name is John Olson. I am with the Northwest MHTTC. I'm on the evaluation team there. So as a result, I'm going to take us through some of the evaluation slides in today's presentation. Now, when we talk about evaluation, we're looking at some of the outcomes that we can have from our work, of course. But those outcomes can be measured in a couple different levels. First, we could look at the target audience, kind of the work that we're actually doing, the workforce development, the trainings, the technical assistance and whatnot. We can see how that's working for our target audience. We can divide those into short and long-term outcomes. So short-term, we might be looking at things like knowledge gains, skills, attitudes, things that we can get from the GIPRA and other measures that we might actually use. In the longer term, especially for more intensive TA or training efforts, we might look at whether a particular evidence-based practice or other strategy is actually being used, how is it implemented, and those kinds of things. So that's kind of the target audience level. But we also can look at the patient or consumer or participant, student, whatever our population of interest is. Ultimately, we can look at that level and actually look at outcomes, the effects of a particular intervention or program or practice or strategy on that particular population. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind as I go through these several slides today to think about evaluation. Okay, oops. Let me go back again. There are a variety of frameworks that we can actually use to do evaluation work. The REAIM is one of many. I'm sure many of you are familiar with REAIM or other favorite models you might have. But for those who aren't, let me just go through some of the basics. The REAIM framework really lends itself well to doing D&I work, dissemination, implementation kind of work, because of its specific focus on implementation. So when we talk about REAIM, it's an acronym for REACH, which is basically are the people who need and want a particular intervention or strategy or training for that matter. The people who want it actually get it? The effectiveness, does it work? That's kind of what we traditionally think of in terms of evaluation. Adoption, are people actually providing or adopting, as we say, or delivering the actual program or strategy? Implementation, are they delivering it well? Is it delivered properly with quality, as we say, fidelity to the actual model? And then maintenance. Maintenance has to do with the kind of sustainability over time. Does it continue to be delivered, and does it continue to work over time? Now, the REAIM framework can help guide TTC evaluations. There's a little bit of a kind of caveat or asterisk there that obviously TTC funding, we're not funded to actually do research per se, but evaluation is a part of the work that we do. Sometimes if we're going to try to get through the entire REAIM framework, we'll need to be a little bit creative in terms of deciding what's most important to measure and how can we creatively assess each part of that REAIM model within the TTCs. And that's what we're going to focus on most of today, is talking about creative ways that we can focus on each piece of this when we do evaluation work. So let's just jump in really quickly to the reach part, the R part of the REAIM framework. And I'm going to go through all of this relatively quickly since I don't have a lot of time, but hopefully it'll plant some seeds for those of you that are new to this and give a nice review for those of you that have done this before. We all do reach. We're required to track reach of our actual trainings, right? So if we're talking at the training or at the participant level, we can track who's actually attending our different sessions, are participating in TA or attending our trainings. We can use GIPRA data to get at some basic demographics and whatnot, but not everybody does the GIPRA, right? So we can back up and do attendance records to see who is actually there. Again, not everybody who registers attends. So in Region 10, oftentimes we will also look at our registration lists to see kind of first who registered, of those who attended, and then of those who actually provided GIPRA data, where we can get some of the demographics as well. So that's at the training level. We also can look at the patient or client or student, or again, whatever that population we ultimately want to impact, especially in intensive TA or training efforts. Who are those people? And there we have to dig a little deeper. We might have to go into administrative records. In Region 10, we've also used interviews to get information about those people who are benefiting from the programs that we are training on, if that makes sense. So a couple steps removed. All right, the E, A, and I parts I'm going to combine together here in this next couple of slides. We look at the effectiveness, adoption, and implementation part of REAIM. And here I'm going to circle back to some of the things we talked about during the last session, that where our implementation science models can really help frame and inform the ways that we track effectiveness, adoption, and implementation fidelity. So this is drawn from the CFR model, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research that we talked about last time. I'm going to go through this really quickly. So for many of you, it'll be a review. If it's new, you'll get the kind of real quick Cliff Notes version here. Oftentimes, we're most interested in the far right part of this model, the outcomes. Here I say for youth and families, but this can be any population that we're working with. You know, it can be adults, or any other group that we're ultimately trying to help support. But to get to those outcomes, and we have a variety of measures I'll talk about in the next slide to measure outcomes. But before we get to that kind of patient-client level outcomes, we need to actually implement something, right? So the next step to the left there would be fidelity implementation, right? Fidelity and implementation success, we say here. So the quality of implementation, basically. But to get to quality implementation, this is where we come in as TTCs, all the training we do, right? So we have these implementation processes that we support, that arrow across the bottom, but that's influenced by all the contextual factors we talked about last time. The outer context, that's those large system level factors, right? You know, funding mechanisms, policies, and those kinds of things. Those influence the inner settings. This is where we do the work, right? The agencies, the places where people actually work, and they have their climates and cultures and leadership characteristics. Within those inner contexts, we have the individuals. These are the people we usually train, the individuals and teams that we're actually training. And of course, you can't forget that there are the characteristics of the intervention or strategy itself. It might be easy. It might, well, few are actually easy, but there are different levels of complexity and resources that are needed to implement them. Okay, so to track all this stuff, to use a technical term, over time, we in Region 10 have a whole host of measures. I'm not going to go over all of these. I certainly don't have the time, but it gives you a little sampling of the types of things we either in Region 10 we have tracked or intend to track in the future, just to plant some seeds that you can either take or leave yourself, I guess. Outcomes, again, kind of following the same path. I'm going to highlight just a couple of these. We've looked at things like behavior change checklists, health indicators, self-report measures, oftentimes the most convenient to use, but oftentimes we'll try to dig deeper. Interviews as well, with people who are actually benefiting from, or at the very least, the people who have implemented, to get some information about the actual outcomes, in our case for youth or families or other kind of clients or patients. Measures of implementation here, fidelity checklists, observation measures, those kinds of things. And it kind of, the list goes on and on. You can kind of take a look at this this slide and see, you know, individual team characteristics. We use the GIPR, we use knowledge quizzes, so on and so forth. Outer setting, there's the stages of implementation completion, public records, those kinds of pieces and that can be used. Inner setting, Greg Aaron's work on implementation climate scale and leadership scale. There's a whole host of measures that can be used to get it, you know, beyond just reach, looking at the evaluation, the implementation, the adoption over, and actually not over time. This is kind of one, not the kind of one point in time kind of measures, but we can then take those one point in time measures and look at sustainability by stretching out across time, right? So to look at that last piece of the REAIM framework, the maintenance piece, by definition, we need to look over time and have those longitudinal measures. So this is just an example from one intensive effort that we did, this is pre-pandemic now, so a couple of years ago, where we had a pre-test, where we looked at quiz and different kinds of attitudes measures. And then we had an e-course. We did a post e-course, which is a primer to the actual main event. And then we had post-training, 30-day follow-up, 3-month follow-up, 6-month follow-up, 12-month follow-up, where we take all those measures. I'm going to go back to the other slide. A lot of these measures that we have here are then taken across time to get that kind of time factor that allows us to see how the effects were sustained or maintained over time. So real quick overview there of some ways that we can start to look at REAIM within the TTC model. Now I'm going to turn it over to Joni, who's going to give some examples of how these kinds of concepts can be put into practice in the real world. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Joni Dolce, and I'm with the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And I wanted to talk briefly about how our center used the REAIM framework in our motivational interviewing intensive TA project. Before I talk about REAIM, I did want to mention that we measured proximal outcomes, specifically looking at pre and post recordings of selected participants. And these recordings were scored by a MINT consultant using the motivational interviewing treatment integrity scale. When we talk about REAIM, we did not measure reach. However, considering the suggestions during today's session and previous sessions through this learning collaborative, I have some ideas about what might be useful in the future in terms of measuring reach, but for our intensive TA project, we did not measure reach. For effectiveness, as you can see, we looked at GIPRA evaluations. We evaluated administrators, direct service staff, and also supervisors. Results are here noted that high percentages of both administrators, direct service providers, and supervisors would recommend the training to a colleague. As you can also see that many agreed that they would use the information in their current practice, as well as expecting that this would benefit their professional practice or development. Let's move on to talk about adoption. Our center created a survey evaluation that looked at participants' view, thoughts around the entire motivational interviewing TA initiative. We included open-ended questions on that evaluation, which was completed in Qualtrics. 100% of respondents found the MI trainings extremely or somewhat helpful. Some of the responses to those open-ended questions on the Qualtrics survey included things like, when we asked what was most helpful, statements included it was thought-provoking and created useful conversations between my colleagues regarding our services and practices and approaches, provided us with a safe place for each of us to share real information, and allowed us to practice in the group to ensure that information was understood practicing MI skills, regular meetings to reinforce practice, getting the chance to have relevant questions answered, learning ways to stop and listen instead of always jumping in with something to say, and creating a common language and framework for thinking across the agency. When we move into looking at implementation or fidelity, adherence, and quality, we held focus groups for administrators as well as staff. So we held one focus group for all of the administrators from each of the 4 organizations that we worked with. So that focus group comprised of approximately 15 individuals. We also met with each organization separately. So each organization had a separate focus group with staff and supervisors combined. Some of the responses that we obtained from the focus groups were things like having that common framework has been very helpful when people are from different backgrounds. Conversations are more coherent. We're very good at providing new staff orientation and one-off training, but to have bachelor's level staff and all staff for that matter learning, having this ongoing learning in the learning community to put it all together has been very useful. For maintenance and sustainment, we don't have any data at this time. There was a survey developed specifically for this initiative to be administered to administrators looking at assessing changes that they made to the organization to sustain and implement MI. Some of the questions for that include, please describe any organizational changes you made that you believe were most critical to the success of your motivational interviewing implementation. This summarizes my section, so I'll pass it along to Scott, who is going to coordinate the breakout session. Thank you.
All right, we'd like to send everybody into our first breakout session, and we'll give you a chance to talk to each other about some of these re-aim dimensions. So if somebody wouldn't mind, if we could have a volunteer leader to just make sure everybody gets a chance to share and keep track of the time. We're going to give you about 10 minutes. And then someone else, if you could just be a recorder and jot a few notes, and when we come back, we'll have a few people give us a report out. So here's what we'd like. Considering these re-aim dimensions of reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and maintenance, as you look back at what you've done on your TTCs, has there been an intensive TA project example where you've been able to measure one or more of these dimensions? And if so, how did you achieve it? And then the second question is, has there been a particular dimension you desired to measure, but it's been difficult to achieve? We'd love for you to talk about that. And if anybody in the group has dealt with that issue and could share what you learned, that would be great. So we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. And thank you. All right, welcome back, everyone. I know in our group we had a good conversation. Anybody willing to report out maybe on that first question? What were some of the things you were hearing in terms of what folks have been measuring and how they were achieving in gathering that data? Anyone?
I can share, Scott. Some of the things that we discussed, we talked about some really brief measures of adoption that have been useful, some observational measures, getting more at fidelity, especially those that might be able to be set up with a confederate or a partner. We talked about measures of perceived mastery being helpful, as well as measures of behavioral intention being ways to kind of set up some of that. And we talked about, which I think was really helpful, the importance of including that measurement collection as a part of the technical assistance, really being something that can be fed back to the organization, and that the organization seems to really appreciate kind of having that feedback loop with those measures as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Baking that all in on the front end, very, very important. Those of you who were reporters taking notes, feel free to put in the chat anything that you heard, you know, that was being measured, that was successful, but also the ones that people struggle with achieving some of those measures. And is anybody willing to report out on that side of it? One of the things I was hoping over time, I know in our center, there are some of those elusive measures, especially on the sustainability side and fidelity. And the more we can hear the creative things that all of us are doing out there and share that, I think it would be great. So it'd be good to have a list. What are those tough dimensions of that re-aim that folks have found a little more difficult to achieve? Anyone want to report out on that?
Scott, I'll jump in just because I think I was in your group and with Molly also. I'll just say we didn't talk about effectiveness much. And I think that's because it is the one that's difficult to measure. I think oftentimes it feels like it's a bridge too far in providing workforce development to get at clinical effectiveness of the interventions once they're implemented. So speaking for at least one, ATTC in Region 10, we've rarely done that. I think maybe in one instance where we did it, and it is very appreciated, but boy, is it time consuming. You get these clinical data sets from partnering organizations that you have to spend a lot of time with trying to extract information about clinical effectiveness. I'm not sure it's worth the time and effort. I think one idea that we're contemplating right now, I guess I'll offer to the group, is we have an evaluator who may go out and provide some tutorial or a form of technical assistance to organizations to help teach them how to evaluate their own programs. As part of a larger, it's a contingency management project for what that's worth, but as part of kind of the secondary systems preparation kinds of things that we're doing within that, we may have our evaluator go out and spend a little bit of time with them so that they can learn to evaluate their own programs. And I do wonder if that's maybe a more direct way and ultimately more helpful way to prepare organizations to monitor what they're doing and what its effectiveness is.
So you're testing that right now, or is that something you've completed?
That is going to be under review in an SOR grant for one of the states in our region.
Okay.
And I expect that it will be funded, and I expect we'll do it, but it's really something that we've just come up with in the last couple of weeks. So it's untested at this point.
That sounds really interesting. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Anyone else before we move on? All right. Well, thank you. Well, I'd like to turn it over to Heather right now. Start talk about our template.
Thanks, Scott. So we've been a bit sneaky throughout the last sessions, and everything that we've talked about, the D&I models, everything is coming down to and has been organized alongside what we call the implementation project template. So I think almost 2 years ago now, our MHTTC D&I working group started developing a template way to track and plan intensive technical assistance projects that have the goal of implementing an intervention or program in practice. And obviously not all of what we do as TTCs is aimed at that, right? We do all kinds of things related to just more strictly workforce development or awareness raising. We talked about the levels of TA model in the first session, where we do a lot of basic TA or targeted TA, and those projects might not be applicable. But this intensive kind of TA projects, we wanted a way to have people think through the D&I science pieces we've talked about as they're planning the project. So the template, we developed originally through the MHTTC group, and then we sent it out for feedback from the ATTCs and PTTCs. And so if you didn't hear about it, it may be because it went through each of the networks has a D&I type group. They have different names, and some of them went to the directors as well. But we got feedback and have now uploaded this template through our MHTTC intranet, which is different than the TTC hub. The MHTTC, we have our own intranet, but this version this template is going to be available to all the TTCs. So in the next kind of section here, I'm going to show you a little bit about what that template looks like in a paper version. You can always use the paper version. Then Scott and I are going to talk a little bit about how the MHTTC NCO used the template to plan a TA project in fall of 2021. And then we're going to have Ricky show you the intranet version, again, which is both the Word version and the intranet version are available for all of you to use as you're planning and tracking projects. So Ricky, if you could pull up that Word document, it should look very familiar to all of you. Again, another sneaky piece here is that when we asked Joni to present her motivational interviewing project from Northeastern Caribbean MHTTC, she was giving her, the pieces that she was talking about all flow through this implementation project template. So it wasn't a heavy lift for her to do the presentations in the last 3 sessions because she'd already filled out this form. So I want to give you a sense of what the form looks like. And this is a form that went out in the meeting information. So you should have a Word version. The version we're looking at now, I completed the first form, and I'll explain the forms in just a second, but I completed the first form for this classroom-wise TA opportunity project. When we send out the meeting information, we can also include some other examples of completed forms. But we conceptualize this tool as having 3 different forms or 3 different versions, so that if you're starting before a project is started and you want to plan and implement an intensive TA project, you'd look at this form number 1 and fill out the information. And then as you get further into the project during the implementation piece, there's a second version. Ricky's going to just scroll down a couple pages to get to the second version. So this is form 2. This is when you're in the middle of the implementation phase. And you'll see in yellow highlight, there's some new questions, and we'll go through that form 1 in detail in a minute, but you'll see there's a few additional questions. How have things changed? It asks you kind of to track like what's going on right now. And then there's a third version of the form when the project is completed, where you're in the sustainment phase, that asks a few more questions, like what are some of the, especially in the evaluation section, what are some of the results that you're getting? Thank you, Ricky. Okay, everyone look away while Ricky scrolls back to that first form. But when I said it should look familiar, it should, because we're walking through each of the pieces. So these first pieces ask, describe your evidence-based intervention program service being implemented. What's the need rationale? What's the target audience or the TA recipients? So you'll see in this version that we're showing right now, we developed an intensive TA project this last fall, we being the MHTTC Network Coordinating Office, related to our classroom-wise 3-part training package that's mental health literacy for teachers and school personnel. So we recognize that just launching an online course and a training package, right, doesn't get things implemented. We talked about that in the first session. So we wanted to provide some technical assistance around classroom-wise to really get schools to be able to implement this classroom-wise package. So the next section is about the target audience and how we engage them. So right, we talked about that in the first session. Our target audience included school teams of at least 4 members per school. It lets you, enter information about the disciplines of the individuals, the roles, and things like that. Then under number 4 here, the contextual and determinant considerations. Those are those facilitators and barriers we talked about in session 2. John presented on this kind of 3-part model that you can use to look at barriers and facilitators at the system level, the organization level, and the individual level. You remember the Mr. Rogers analogy he used. So here we entered information about what we understood the barriers and facilitators of Classroom-Wise to be. And so those included things like time to take it, staff interest, whether states were mandating educator training, whether a school was interested in mandating people to take Classroom-Wise. And then the next section on implementation strategies. Again, in our last session, we talked about implementation strategies. And those are the TA activities, right, that we all do. And so you can describe each of the TA activities, what the format is, how many times you're going to do that strategy, and how frequently. So for this project, we decided to try to understand what package of implementation strategies was going to work best. So we had one group of schools that received a kind of a bare bones basic TA package, which just included a Classroom-Wise implementation guide about how to use Classroom-Wise. And we held a 60-minute orientation session for the schools that were in this project. So that's like the basic implementation. And then for our enhanced implementation schools, we also included 2 90-minute community of practice sessions and a 1-hour facilitation session with each school, where we had experts on the Classroom-Wise package meet with the school team just themselves to talk through how they wanted to implement Classroom-Wise. So those were the TA strategies we provided in these 2 packages, because we're really interested in seeing, is the basic TA enough for Classroom-Wise, or do we really need to provide more in-depth TA? And so for the evaluation, then we really wanted to understand, again, which of these 2 packages was going to be most beneficial for schools. So this evaluation section starts off, again, by talking about how many people you're planning to enroll, then those proximal training with TA outcomes. Those proximal training or TA outcomes are things like GIPRA, just basic satisfaction pieces. And then down under re-aim, if you can scroll down a bit, Ricky. Here are examples of how we wanted to measure those re-aim pieces. So they included, like for adoption, the number and percent of educators and staff at each school who completed the online course. That's what we thought was like the most basic way to measure adoption. It's not perfect at all, but was something that we could get at. For implementation fidelity or adherence or quality, we looked at pre-course survey and then a 3-month follow-up, and asked questions about how people use the strategies and what their change in knowledge was from the information in the online course. And then in terms of maintenance, which is obviously difficult to get at, right? We aren't often able to do long-term follow-ups, but for maintenance, we did some 3-month feedback sessions where we kind of like focus groups where we asked, we had some with participants who took the online course, and we also did some with our school teams to find out how they used the materials in Classroom-Wise, what strategies from Classroom-Wise they were implementing, et cetera. So again, hopefully the format of this implementation template looks really familiar to you. That was just a snapshot of what again, Form 1 looks like. And I wanted to invite Scott to kind of dialogue with me a little bit about how this form can be used or could be used.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I got kind of a 2-part question for you just around process. So what was the startup process for you to use the template with your team? And then there's just so much detail as you work through it. How'd you go about deciding on the specifics of the project itself?
Yeah, so I admit it was a little, even for me, it was a little daunting when we were starting to think about wanting to provide, some intensive TA about this classroom-wise product that, that the whole network had collaborated on to develop. It felt a little daunting. And so having just developed the template, in the previous year, it seemed like a perfect way to kind of get our thoughts in order about what's our purpose, what's our goal, what do we really want to do, and really make sure we were using the dissemination and implementation frameworks and strategies that we've been talking about the last 3 sessions in the, to really do the work. Because obviously it's one thing to just talk about them, and it's another to actually put them in practice. So some of the pieces kind of came together pretty easily. Like, we already had an idea of the audience and, some things like that. And then some of it we really had to work through and talk about, like, well, what implementation strategies or TA activities would really be helpful? What do we think schools really need? Again, just tried to channel all the work, all the D&I knowledge, right, that we've been talking about in these sessions into the form as we were planning.
So you'd have your team meetings, and this almost becomes an agenda outline for the conversations for each.
Exactly. Yep. Ricky became intently aware of this template, which he hadn't been in on the planning of originally, but he and Jessica, right, our NCO school mental health folks, learned this very, very intently as we were walking through it.
That's great.
And we were able to use it we worked with the National Center for School Mental Health on this project, and our collaborators, and we pulled them into it, and it talked them through the project because they were kind of our TA partners for this.
I see. So did you hit any challenges in using the tool, and have any strategies to overcome that? Or
probably like you're all thinking, the evaluation was the stickiest piece. I thought, I'm also, like Jonathan, an evaluator at heart, and so there were a lot of things I wanted to do, but we are, as TTCs, in some ways I think we're so not as limited as we think we are in terms of what we can do for evaluation, but we also need to be really mindful of burden on our participants and our learners. And so we had all these grand plans, or maybe I had all these grand plans for evaluation and different standardized tools we could use. And then we had like the, come to reality meeting where we said, well, what do we really need to know? And how can we really assess? What do we, what's the key? But we also we found some good examples, including some of John's examples from Northwest MHTTC and some from our content partner, the National Center, that we were able to pull in and I think make an evaluation that was reasonable. Like everyone, it's difficult to get people to follow up. And so the evaluation did not go exactly as planned, but I do feel like we got some good information out that we're just, in the process of creating some, sorry, just lost my train of thought, creating some presentations for, and we'll be feeding back information to our centers to say, here's what we found in terms of whether that basic TA package or the enhanced TA package worked, which of course, as you would imagine, right? Many more schools in the enhanced TA pack who got the enhanced TA package actually did something with classroom wise versus the school. You can't just do an orientation webinar and give people a toolkit and think that they're going to implement something. We just know that that's not how that works.
So when
there's something specific about the school where they were like super motivated or they had champions, right, or something, there's some little, that secret sauce you call it, Scott,
yeah,
for a couple of the schools, but.
Well, that's great. So last question, when you look back using the template, are there a few key benefits that rise to the surface why you would want to keep using it?
I really found that it kept us on track. Again, I've been in the behavioral health TA business a really long time, my whole career. And this I found to be just help make the planning process much more easy, than it could be. There's another piece to, so I highly recommend folks use this. Again, this is not for everything you do at your TTC, but if you're planning something that's an intensive project, even if you're just using the Word form, I think it can be helpful. I want to put a plug in for using the intranet version because it's online and you'll be able to get your information back out of it. But that also lets us look across TTCs or across MHTTCs or whatever to see what people are doing and how they're doing it and whether or not it works. So we have a slide that we ended up cutting because of time today, but that gave some examples on the REAIM framework of what people have done to measure those different pieces of REAIM, which I think can be difficult to kind of think through. We're able to do that because we had 11, right now in the intranet, we have 11 or 12 projects that people from our MHTTC working group have already implemented. And you're able to go in and look at those. Anyone can go in and look at those and say like, oh, so Scott, you did this particular project and here's what you did. And here's how you evaluated things. So we really want that intranet version to be something that everyone can look at across the 3 networks and learn from each other.
Great, thank you. Anyone else before we move on have a question for Heather about the template or her experience? All right, well, thank you, Heather.
Thanks. So I think next we're turning to Ricky to show us on the MHTTC intranet how you would access the template.
That is correct. Okay, so I'm going to take it from the top and just start by creating an account. So here I've sent myself an email to join the intranet. So I'm going to log in. And if my internet cooperates, there we go. So I'm just going to basically type in my email, my center. I'm just going to put my first and last name, my role within my center. And I'm just going to put a password. I have to put the temporary password from the email. So I'm going to copy and paste that. And then I'm just going to create a password. Okay. All right, so this is what it's going to look like when you first log in. So for the ATTC and PTTC members in this call, you're going to have access to these materials. So you're going to have access to the implementation projects. You'll be able to access any projects you've entered, and you'll be able to search for projects. And then for the MHTTC side, you'll have access to the event certificates and other links that may be useful for your work. But I'm going to transition over to my account. So I'm going to reshare my screen. So give me 1 second here. Okay, so I'm going to change this here. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my new project. And here it's just going to ask you to enter the name of your project. So I will put Heather's as an example. Okay, so then I'll click save, and then this is what will pop up. And here I've pre-filled everything from Heather's template that she sent to me. So I've got access to all of this in here. And so what I'm going to show is how to make edits and save them. So I'm just going to briefly take this out. I'm going to click save. All right, and it should say, there we go, your project was saved successfully. So if I go to my projects, my project will show up right here, so I can go back in and edit it. And I'm in phase 1, so that first form that Heather described earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and click into that. And then I'll go back in and I'm going to re-enter that part here under maintenance. Okay, and then when you're ready to move your project over to the next stage, you're going to click this checkbox, and then you're going to click Save. And this will take you to the next phase of the form. So Heather said that there are 3 phases, so this will take me to phase 2. So now that's saved successfully, I'm going to go back into my projects. Let me see if I can click Edit, and see, it'll move me to phase 2. I'll go into that implementation phase, and when I have that information, I'll be able to make the changes as needed. So, and one of the changes in phase 2, for example, was related to how many actually enrolled, and then how the percent of organizations or individuals initiating at least one implementation strategy. And then if I want to search for a finished project to demonstrate what that would look like, I'll go to the MI project that Northeastern Caribbean did and that Joni spoke about earlier. So if I click View, it's all going to pop up in this tab here. So you'll be able to see what the project was, the start date, the end date, the need, the rationale, target audience, TA recipients. And you'll have access to the barriers and facilitators that they listed, as well as the different implementation strategies they used, the sequence of those strategies, how many people were planned for enrollment and how many actually enrolled, and then how many were initiating a strategy and then completed 50% and 80% of those activities related to each strategy. And then here you'll see the column for how they measured each part of the REAIM framework and the results if they were made available. And that's just a basic demonstration of the intranet. If you do want access, you feel free to email me and I'm happy to go ahead and send you an invite to join.
Thanks, Ricky. Any questions? Again, this is something that's open to centers to use. If you need any assistance in accessing the implementation template on the intranet, the MHTTC intranet, please let us know. And you're welcome to use the Word version, just in your internal planning or however you'd like to. I think we're transitioning to Molly.
All right. Well, we told you at the beginning of this that we were going to give you a little bit of a chance to play around with these questions and think about a project that you may be involved in. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend just about 5 minutes where we're going to think about an intensive training or technical assistance project that you or your team have either already completed or maybe you're planning to work on. And find a piece of paper, open up a screen in Word, find something that you can write on. But we're going to take just a few minutes to answer sort of some high-level questions that come from that template. And so those high-level questions are, what is the need or the rationale for the project? Who's your target audience? How did you or will you recruit or engage that audience? What system, individual, or organizational factors may aid that implementation, and what may be the barriers, the facilitators and barriers? And then lastly, identify some of the implementation strategies that you may use. Okay, so we're going to leave these questions up on the screen, so you don't actually have to have your form open, but if you do, you're welcome to use that. And we'll take about 5 minutes to kind of think on our own about the answers to those questions, and then we'll break up into our little groups and just kind of talk about what that was like, how that felt. Okay. All right. Any questions that people have? I was having a hard time finding my mouse. All right. So thanks for taking some time to think through those. What we're going to do next, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, there we go. We have some questions for your breakout room. Really to understand sort of what the experience was like completing these templates. Were some aspects of it more challenging, some of it easier, etc. And so the questions are, I'm going to put them in the chat, but Heather has also added them on the Google document. So you should be having those in your breakout rooms, and we'll take about 10 minutes to kind of have a little bit of discussion. All right, thank you everyone for that. I'm wondering if anybody would like to share just a little nugget of some of the conversation that they had. Would anybody like to do that? I know in our room we were having some really practical conversations about how do we incorporate this in our work with our team, support our staff, but also not make sure that we are not we've got the resources we need to do the work. So some really good practical discussions, I think, about in what ways this will help support the work and how we make that be as efficient as possible. Anybody else have anything?
I can share comments from our group, which I think kind of parallel what you're saying, Molly, that a few of us were like, our first reaction to the form is like, oh, that kind of looks overwhelming. That's a lot. It's not like we don't do that in our heads, but to write it all out. But at the same time, seeing it as being really valuable, and trying to make sure that we're not creating more work for ourselves. So we talked about, well, if we're doing this in other ways, how do we streamline? I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, but like, how do we streamline using that? But overall, I think everybody agreed that it would be a really useful tool and helpful in thinking through the implementation process. I think one thing that we talked about was, there are some differences sometimes if you're implementing an evidence-based practice, say like motivational interviewing, versus if you're implementing like a NIATEX process improvement or a systems change or a coalition building. And so having to figure out kind of how to apply it, depending on what it is that you're assisting people in implementing. So that was some of the comments from our group.
Yes. Yeah, very great points. Some of what we were pondering about was even, as we were having these discussions, which we're having with our staff anyway, right? We're planning these things. How can we, use those discussions, fill in aspects of the tool where we're not actually asking, folks to spend time specifically in filling out the form, but to use that to document some of the decisions that we're making along the way as we go. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to pass it back for some additional.
Great. Thank you, Molly. Hi, everyone. Again, this is Rochelle. So we wanted to just offer some next steps that for all of you in terms of how to use dissemination and implementation science in your work. And so during this session, what we offered to you was an implementation template that can help you to plan or monitor your TA projects. Again, this is really meant to be a tool for you. It's not a requirement of our centers. And we hope that there's some opportunity to find ways to learn from each other, to create opportunities to connect with each other. Maybe there might be some similar context or similar programming that is happening. And so as somebody in our work group said, it's an opportunity to not reinvent the wheel, right? To learn from our reflections and to be intentional about that. It also offers an opportunity for you to be thinking about how you might tailor implementation strategies in TA based on the need. And then the other thing to be thinking about that we talked about today a little bit more was around how to think about evaluation. How are we collecting information to help inform our work? And I think we kind of all heard a theme of, the beginning parts of the REAIM framework. It was a little bit easier to collect information on those efforts around who we're reaching and how we're reaching them, et cetera. But as we got down to the M part of REAIM is that, understanding the maintenance and the sustainability of our efforts is a lot harder. So I think we're continuously learning in this process. So we wanted to offer some ways that we might be able to help. And so you'll see in the next slide that we will definitely be sharing recordings and slides from these sessions. You will now also, as part of our dissemination strategy, we'll be sharing a handbook and a template manual that you can be using. We talked a little bit in our small groups around like, how would you use the forms that were the summaries that were done by other centers? How could that help you? And so we hope that there's opportunity for that kind of cross-fertilization to happen. And Heather also had put in the chat earlier that we can offer, the NCO can offer some opportunity to have office hours so that people can learn a little bit more about the template, get a little bit hands-on experience, and or have questions answered as well. I think there was also a request for some sample questions for different parts of the RE-AIM framework. And so we'll look into sharing those as well. So Ricky, Ricky has a question on Poll Everywhere that we wanted to collect or again, get your insights on, like what would be most useful for you. And so if you can click on the link that Ricky offered, I think you just have to put your name in, except for, or you can skip it. So don't worry about sharing your name. But the question is, how can we help you use D&I in your work? This is a series that we planned. We're hoping that there is opportunity for you to now integrate this into your own work. So please let us know what might be useful for you. I'll just give you a moment to think about that. So offering some coaching sessions would be helpful. I'll just say when you're you get your funding for year 5 to be strength-based here, more training, detailed instructions on how to access the template. Definitely we'll have that. We'll share some more tools with you. Great. So it looks like that template and manual will be useful. Specific TA offer to the evaluators. That's something helpful for us to think about, especially as we do have an evaluators community of practice. So could definitely look at that. So good. So summaries, everyone is going to have summaries available from the other centers. So as soon as you log in, as you look at that left side menu that Ricky showed, you'll have access to other centers' summaries. So great. Glad to hear that the manual and the templates will be useful. So thank you for sharing that. And Ricky, I guess you could just keep that open while we move on to the next, but you can change sharing your screen, sorry. We do, of course, we would not be evaluators without asking you for your feedback also on the session. So we do have a QR code here and we want to ask you for your feedback on the sessions, especially it might help inform any future trainings that we might be able to offer for you. So if you could give us feedback as well, that would be great. And in the meantime, I just want to make sure that I'm, again, thanking our entire team. This was definitely a collective and group process. Again, thank you to Heather and Ricky from the NCO, to John from Region 10, to Scott from Region the Great Lakes. I forget my numbers. So Great Lakes region, Molly from the Southwest, and Joni for sharing her example for us throughout each of these sessions. And just want to thank you for being with us for these 3 sessions and hope that you found it useful. And we'll look forward to your feedback, and we'll definitely be taking that into account as we think about future opportunities. So again, thank you so much. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your Monday and enjoy some of your summer treats that you shared with us earlier in the community builder. Thank you, everyone.